Thanks for organizing this. Really, very much appreciate being here. And it's a great pleasure to be with such wonderful panelists who I respect so much. So I'll be really very brief. When Johannes first wrote me, I said, "Why? What do you want me to say?" And he had read this essay I'd recently written, so I'm just going to use that as an opening. So I wrote this essay for the American Enterprise Institute with the sort of pretentious title, "The U.S. Approach to Antitrust Policy in Technology Markets." And it's a comparative essay about three major cases, where the last one is the one that was pending against Google as of, or Alphabet, if you will, as of the fall. Of course, there's been a bunch of recent filings since then, but I'm still only going to refer to the federal case in the fall. And the principal point of the essay is just to point out how the economics of these three cases are similar and alike, and also how they're different. And to do it in sort of plain language and not advocate for a legal position, but rather to just explain how they stand next to each other. And as I would like to joke, I didn't put any footnotes, so it's much shorter than a legal law review, and perhaps more accessible for the standard policy audience in Washington. It's 6,000 words long, and I often say, with some seriousness, it's for a policy maker who doesn't know their history, and also with some cheeky relevance, but also some seriousness. Plenty of academics who are too embarrassed to admit that they really have not paid attention to any of this, but need a foothold to get inside of what's going on. So that's the purpose of it. And given 5 minutes, I'm just going to tell you after reviewing the three cases, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the way the U.S. tends to approach antitrust. I'll start with the drawbacks. Certainly, one of the often remarked drawbacks is it is one target at a time. It's not a panacea the way the U.S. does antitrust. Even though many commentators sometimes treat it as such, that everything relates to competition, and I think that's just not correct way to characterize historically what's occurred and what's likely to continue. Second, it's an inherently slow process. It goes through the courts, and that is problematic when markets move very fast. It works best when what I would call a conscientious, self-regulated CEO. And most CEOs are just not schooled in this topic. And really, they lack reasons to pay attention to antitrust until they are on trial. It's just not a part of standard education. And many CEOs don't understand why they need to pay any attention. And finally, it often relies, if you read the remedies carefully, it relies on, it has an abiding faith in competition and therefore relies on competition in addition to the court's relief, to court's remedy. It relies on competition to make the remedy most effective. Its strengths, in contrast, are it tends to focus quite a lot of attention on impediments to pluralism in supply, particularly in innovative markets. This is something I often don't hear people say, and that's one of the things I wanted to stress. Where by pluralism, I mean a significant number and variety of options brought to market to compete with the dominant firm. And antitrust tends to bring a lot of attention to whether there's impediments to that. It does not tend to be a one-size-fits-all approach, or if you will, it's very flexible. And that is true of both the way it analyzes issues and remedies them. And that is today actually a principal question on the table, which is another reason to raise it. And finally, the remedies tend to have an abiding faith in markets. That if you read them, that is often a strength because they work well when removing an impediment does in fact unleash a pluralistic supply. And as it's turned out, most tech markets in the US have that characteristic once you do remove impediments. So finally, last thing I'm going to say, it does bring some attention to the Google-Apple deal, which has not received, or is starting to receive more attention, but it had not when I first wrote this essay. And I just want to say, there's a deal, Google pays Apple to be exclusive default on the iPhone. It's worth about $8 billion as of 2020. There's another $4 billion as of 2020 for other things. And just to be really clear, there's nothing wrong with having Google on as an app on the phone, just like everyone else. The issue that arises is because there's money changing hands. And so the essay just goes through both sides. It's a neutral essay. I'm not taking sides, but I want to say when you look at the economics of it, it boils down to two direct competitors cooperating for money, and it reduces competitive features. Now, what are the usual economic arguments in such a situation? If these were not dominant firms, this would just be fine. If there were plenty of competition. But I mean, I think a lot of us would be skeptical that that's the case here. And so that unless there's some essential economic fact missing from the public record, as I walked through it, I've found myself being rather skeptical of an economic justification for the kind of coziness we're observing here. Now, maybe there's a legal justification because the law for platforms has been changing most recently, and it's nice to have Herb here. He probably has something to say about it. But as an economist, I would say if this makes it past the U.S. court, it does mark a pivot in the way I think most of us read antitrust law. So the last thing the essay does say is I'm watching history and trying to forecast the future on the basis of the past. Both brands are going to pay a price for the course of scrutiny that's going to be visited on this deal. And that's sort of interesting because Google's the one, or Alphabet is the one who's the focus of the inquiry, but Apple is not. And yet I suspect they're going to pay quite a high price for this in the kind of ridicule they're going to be put through in the public once stuff comes to light. So that was it for just an introduction. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much,
Shane. How do I stop? Here we go.
And officially welcome to Annabelle Gawer. It worked. Fantastic.
Hey, Annabelle.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Good to have you here. Yes, we can hear and see you.
That's wonderful. I can hear you. You can hear me. We can see each other. And Shane just gave a really interesting set of ideas. So delighted.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So the guiding question you posed, Volker, and thank you very much to you and Professor Johannes Ram as well to organize this, is to expand a bit on the positive and the negative roles of big tech firms for innovation and competition in the digital economy. So I think that there's a lot of positive, but as but there's an increasing concern that the negative is creeping up, and that requires us scholars as well as regulators to perhaps understand deeper the mechanisms of what is going on. So just very briefly to recall, platforms, I think are becoming the dominant model of organizational form and the dominant business model in the digital economy, because they take advantage of the technological conditions afforded by pervasive connectivity, and the fact that machines, organizations, and individuals are connected on a continuous basis, and that they generate data as well as capture data. And therefore, the value proposition of connecting, of taking advantage of the structure of connectivity, which the internet and mobile connectivity is allowing, the value proposition of connecting various parts of various agents is great. And what we have observed is that there is a kind of economies of scale that goes with the job of connecting. And platform firms really are facilitating those connections across multiple sides of the platforms, whether they are end users and creators of content, or developers of video games and players of video games, or advertisers who want to connect to users who happen to be there because they want a research to a search query. So there is a big business around this activity of connecting multiple sites, which are, you may have heard the word network effects. There's a lot of network effects in those industries, which is a kind of demand side economies of scale. So there are real efficiency benefits to having actors that are at the center or at the nexus of interconnections and that are playing a role by governing the rules of connections among those different sites. And we've seen, the emergence of social networks. We've seen, obviously, the big GAFAM who have among the most market capitalized companies in the world, who have become in their own right a kind of private infrastructures for commerce. I heard recently that, we know that Europe has had a really hard time creating a digital single market where sellers from different countries would be able to sell to users in different countries. There was a patchwork of rules. It turns out there is a digital single market. It's called Amazon. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but that is really the value that such private infrastructures have developed. Equally, you could say that Facebook has become sort of an infrastructure for communication. Now, the reason I use infrastructure here is by design. Is to ask the question of the governance of those new modalities of value creation. We have seen that there is a paradox between, a very distributed modality of value creation, in which lots of individuals all over the world can contribute to the value being created by virtue of their generating data and then being connectable. So distributed modalities of value creation, but the paradox is very centralized modality of value capture. So we have seen a huge concentration in terms of where the profits come from, where the profits go to. And so what we have seen now in that context, where there are economic reasons why some firms become central nexus of value capture, and the economic reasons have to do with the fact that there is actually value in centralizing some of these activities, so it becomes a nexus via which those connections happen. The problem is that those companies become, and we all become, the victim of this success, which is that the role of governance of the ecosystem, which used to be sort of something that people may or may not have thought very carefully about in the early days of these platforms, focusing on the economic benefits, the question of governance of these ecosystems becomes important and even paramount when some of those private infrastructures are governing veritable economies that have millions and millions of users, and when the financial power of these companies can be greater than many governments. And that's where we get into this messy area of what are the possible negatives in terms of innovation and competition. Because just like any other private firm, companies are going to try to maintain their competitive advantage. And in order to maintain a competitive advantage, companies are going to naturally try to erect some kind of barriers to entry. Now, so what, some people in our professions think there really isn't a big problem here. If we just let market play their role, there is going to be a kind of dynamic competition that is going to happen, and newcomers are going to come in and dethrone the big players of today. And they give as example of, look at Microsoft, they lost some leadership in the 90s. Look at IBM, they also lost some leadership. But it's really hard to take that as a pure counterfactual, because there were those big antitrust lawsuits against IBM and against Microsoft. And really, I don't think any of us really know what would have happened if the antitrust lawsuit hadn't occurred, hadn't, perhaps drained managerial attention, perhaps had shaped the way in which IBM, for example, restrained itself to go aggressively against the clones. So we are really living a sort of a major global experiment in which there is a new form of power that is being expressed via these new kind of organizations. And economics tells us that those actors are going to have the incentives, and we know they have the capabilities to try to diminish a certain kind of innovation, which is going to be innovation on substitutes, while they have incentives and capabilities to stimulate another kind of innovation, which is innovation on complements. Now, those of us that have worked on platforms, for a long time, Shane, for example, with his great paper with Tim Bresnahan, one of the very first one in 1991, looking at those behaviors, and I've done some of that work myself since the early 2000s. We know that platforms, of course, they want innovation to happen. They want a specific kind of innovation, which is innovation on complements, which is great, which is why the platform or a subset of platforms, which I call innovation platform, are really good for innovation. But do we really want, and that's a question I would love to hear the panel about and the audience as well, do we really want as an end game an economy and a society where a very small number of uncontestable companies orchestrate the kind of innovation that we are allowed to happen and focus, innovation on the complements that will enhance their competitive position? Do we want those decisions to be made in a way that is not contestable or not? And I would also love to hear the views of the panelists on what are their views on certain current efforts from regulators, such as, for example, in the EU, the Digital Markets Act, that is aiming to make the digital markets more contestable by imposing ex ante a list of do's and don'ts, and among the do there are some interoperability obligations. I would really love to hear what the panelists have to say about that. And I will stop my initial remarks here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. A lot of food for thought already in preparing discussion in the panel. Excellent. And Herb, you're next.
Thank
Please
you.
Go ahead.
You can hear me? Good. My focus is going to be a little narrower than both Shane and Annabelle. I want to talk a little bit about gatekeeper competition policy, which is a new focus in competition policy. The Europeans are a little bit ahead of us in the U.S. I'm going to take kind of a U.S. perspective because that's the one that I have, and just offer a couple of points. Number one, I think designating gatekeepers on the basis of absolute size measured by usage or revenue is a mistake. I mean, under the current proposals that did not get through Congress last year, mainly the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, basically the gatekeepers would have been Microsoft, Meta, Facebook, Alphabet, Amazon, and Apple, and maybe another firm or two. Facebook had a big decline in usage midway through the year and actually dropped below the threshold. I think that's an inherent problem in regulating on the basis of size. And I think it violates a pretty important principle in antitrust law, which is that market power attaches to products, not to firms. Every one of these firms produces multiple products, and they have different amounts of market power or leverage in different products. For example, Microsoft is a very, very large firm, but its search engine, Bing, occupies less than 3% of the market. So so the approach taken in the AICOA of designating firms on the basis of large gross size and then supplying heightened scrutiny to them without regard to what their market share is in a particular product or their dominance in a particular product, I think is mistaken. Now, to be sure, there are places where firms can exert leverage from one position to another, such as Alphabet with its positions in Android and Google Search. Of course, Google Search is doing the same thing with respect to Apple in the situations that Shane just pointed out. Here, I think it's very important not to confuse multi-product leverage from economies of scope. I mean, for example, when Amazon sells ebooks and then also sells a set of tablets and readers that are optimized for ebooks. Is that anti-competitive leverage? Probably not. It's probably really taking advantage of economies of scope, particularly since it makes ebook readers available at no charge for all kinds of other devices as well. Okay, that's my first problem. My second problem is I do not think the case has yet been made for applying particular aggressiveness in competition policy to online firms. We don't actually have a lot of data about comparing the competitiveness of online and traditional markets. To the extent we have information, the online markets seem to be working pretty well. Search costs are lower in online markets. There's more economic growth in online markets, and by a very, very wide margin. Price fixing does not seem to be a bigger problem. So if you look at the usual indicia that demand antitrust intervention, stagnant markets, low rates of innovation, failure of entry for decades and decades, those are the reasons we classically try to intervene in markets. None of them seem to me to be particularly characteristic of online commerce. If anything, the online markets are showing more innovation and vitality than non-line markets. And so I think any approach we take with respect to competitive outcomes needs to be more balanced as between online and traditional markets. Why would we want to apply these aggressive rules about product sales, for example, to Amazon, when we don't apply them to Walmart, which is actually a little bit bigger than Amazon in terms of dollar volume? And the reason, of course, we don't is that Walmart's online presence is relatively small, while its brick and mortar presence is much larger. That just does not make a lot of sense to me. So I think those two issues, the designation of gatekeeper on the basis of firm size rather than product market share, and also this particular attention to online markets as a special competition policy, I think those are two things we need to rethink a little bit. I'm done.
Well, thank you all for these really stimulating opening statements. Annabelle, welcome. I should say I introduced you in your absence with the anticipation and hope that you would be able to wiggle your way in. So it's great to see you in person, and thank you for your eloquent remarks, and also Shane and Herb. You already mentioned several points that we wanted to explore a little bit more deeply in our discussion here for the next maybe 30, 40 minutes or so. And maybe let me start from this notion of gatekeepers and competition, right? Because it has become such an important idea that now we have this new sort of class of market distortion or market power that we call gatekeepers. The notion of gatekeepers, some of us probably remember, comes more from the media theory and sociology from the 1940s or so, when we worried about editors. There's kind of a certain ambivalence already there, because part of the public policy discussion today is that we want platforms to be more strongly armed gatekeepers when it comes to certain types of content. But let's go back to the economic question here, and that is, are sort of our notions that we use to inform these discussions, right? What do we mean by competition? What do we mean by market power? Are those still appropriate for this environment of ecosystem competition, where we have a unique market organization in the sense that Annabelle described, where you have companies that orchestrate complementary activities and have a strong incentive to support innovation in those complementary activities. But as they become larger, perhaps, and sort of absorb some of those activities into their own, business and product spaces, they may also become substitutes, right? And then have a different set of incentives. And I think you, Annabelle, in some of your work, refer to this as a moral hazard or moral hazard-like issue that we face and may need to overcome. But I want to dig a little bit deeper, right? I mean, so the two notions of competition that inform our thinking are, on the one hand, this notion of perfect competition. And although we rarely talk about it, economics, industrial organization, welfare economics is really infused by this comparative standard of perfect competition. On the other hand, if you look at the neo-Brandesian arguments, right, they don't necessarily talk about it explicitly, but implicitly in their thinking, this idea of perfect competition still seems to linger in the bottom. And maybe with some taste of a notion from that goes back to the 1950s of workable competition. But I want to venture here and maybe throw out to you as a question: do we have a sufficiently strong and reliable and robust analytical understanding of how competition works in these ecosystems that can inform these policy decisions, or do we need to, as we think about specific cases, do we also need to invest in rethinking competition? Schumpeter, for example, said that a system that is always in a state of imperfect competition in the long run will be more efficient than one that is always in a state of close to perfect competition, right? So I wanted to throw this question out to you. What do we know about competition? How does it work in those platform ecosystems? Do we need new approaches, or are the existing ones robust enough to address those issues? And I think we'll just, whoever wants to jump in and take the question.
I'll be glad to take something if that's okay.
Yes, please.
I think from where I stand, the most workable model for addressing digital commerce is classical monopolistic competition. That is to say, easy entry, firms compete very heavily by differentiating their products rather than cutting price to marginal cost. And associated with product differentiation, of course, is higher degrees of innovation. And we can debate about whether we think that's fundamentally bad or good things, but those are characteristics of the internet market. For example, I think the whole winner-take-all debate regarding networks has been clouded by the fact that our classical models of natural monopoly always assume that all the firms face the same demand curve. You know, they're talking about water or natural gas or a bridge through a railroad pass or something like that. But the thing is, there are probably very few networks that are winner-take-all markets, because the ability to differentiate one's product means that new entry can frequently occur even vis-a-vis fairly dominant networks. I mean, look at Twitter and TikTok and their growth vis-a-vis Facebook, for example. I think there are certain markets, such as search, where meaningful product differentiation has been difficult to pull off. I mean, you think about search for a second. Switching costs could not be lower than they are for search engines, leaving aside Shane's very important limitation on default search engines on handheld devices. Those are sticky. They are stickier than they are on desktops and laptops. But other than that, search engines, they're free. You don't have to register. You don't have to put in your credit card number. You can walk up to a strange computer in a library or something and choose a search engine and make an easy search. So why is it that Google is able to maintain what is pretty close to a 93% market share? Very large rivals like Microsoft have stumbled on that. DuckDuckGo made an attempt to get into the market by offering confidential or secret searching, but turns out the problem with that is everybody could copy it. And so pretty much all the big search engines today have confidential or shadow modes that don't collect a lot of data. I think that's one situation where we need to take a lot closer look. And by the way, I do agree with Shane that we need to think about the default status that Google Search enjoys on both iPhones and Android phones. The EU has already addressed the Android phone situation. But you know, that's a fairly small number of markets that really have winner-take-all status. Most of the networks are much more open to product differentiated competition. And then I've got one more qualifier, and then I want to shut up. I think one of the biggest problems with respect to the large digital platforms is repeated ongoing acquisitions of potential rivals. They have gobbled up, they have acquired firms that number in the hundreds: Amazon, Meta, Alphabet, Apple, all of them have done it. We know from the Facebook complaint that one of the principal reasons Facebook acquired Instagram was because it appreciated Instagram as a potential rival. And I think they are pursuing a strategy of acquiring nascent small firms who have the capacity to grow into competitors. But for that, we need a little stronger focus on merger policy, not on suppressing the activities of the platforms themselves.
Thank you. Any other takers on the how do you operationalize competition question?
I would like to hear what Shane has to say.
I have a lot of thoughts, but they're not coherent. I don't really. Both of you have said some very interesting things, and for the most part, I don't disagree with them. The one thing that hasn't been raised yet, as try to at least get one more thing on the table, in the presence of economies of scale and a coordinating function. So those two things which you tend to see across most of the online platforms. A question that's often raised, I think I would use the old antitrust language of self-dealing. Is there potentially an issue with self-dealing? And the interesting thing about that is the analysis of that question varies depending on what it is that platforms do. So this is going to go back to the theme I was raising, that there does not seem to be a one-size-fits-all approach to self-dealing, even if you thought there was a problem. And just to give an example of why it's so different across different platforms. So for example, in the Amazon platform, a very common concern is about Amazon putting forward on its retail side its own products that it sponsors. And per se, that activity per se can't be necessarily problematic, because if they're putting forward lower priced products, what's the problem? Arguably, that's in consumer interest. And so you have to per se, you have to be look more carefully to see if the self-provisioning is substituting for things that would otherwise be better, if it's getting in the way of new entry, if it has some distortionary characteristic. And if it doesn't, then you're sort of left with, well, why is that a problem? Okay, so that's just one example. Now compare it to another place where self-dealing is now also showing up as a concern say in the Google auctions. There's in the most recent filing, there's concern that the auctions are structured in such a way as to keep advertisers coming back to Google, not going to other auctions for ads and for other syndicates for ads. And again, don't want to assess it per se. I just want to make the point that on the one hand, anybody who's taken a look at that auction can't help but walk away and say, damn, is that efficient? So you have to walk away with a healthy respect for the efficiency of what Google has built as your starting point. And so there's clearly on the one side a piece there, and it's quite different than anything we're talking about in Amazon. the way that auction is structured, it's got a quality rating. The quality rating goes for, the sites to which the ad points. That gives the ads incentives to improve their landing pages. That has some really interesting efficiency characteristics to it. On the other hand, it's using a lot of data that's not available to anybody else. There's concern that that's self-dealing, that makes it challenging to have a competitive process. I mean, I just, and you have to get into real detail to talk about that. And my only point to raising that is that across those two examples, and that's only two, you already need very different kinds of analysis to examine self-dealing in detail. And so that suggests, again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I could even go to another place where this is emerging, has long been a complaint among programmers about the way Apple limits what app providers can do on its iPhone. I know that's one of the other issues that's often raised. And again, there you're gonna go on two sides there. There's clearly some efficiency gains to Apple from being able to vet apps in advance, and and it's an important piece of their branding that they have a secure platform. And I gotta say that's helped them a great deal, and it still helps them today. So that's on the one side, and on the other, there's concern that it limits sales, it limits distribution. That's a classic concern inside antitrust. But boy, that one looks very different too than the other two we just talked about. So the point being that that's something no one has raised yet so far, and when I think about the issues with economies of scale and platforms as we're seeing them, that one I always find that very, very interesting in the present.
So I thank you, Shane, and I would like to add a few points here to answer Johannes' question of whether our existing theories provide us with the right tools, the right perspectives, the right approach to understand the phenomenon that we are observing, or not, right? So it's sort of a big provocative question about, does our current understanding of competition, is that going to help us out of what many, myself included, but I may be wrong, think, a pretty concerning situation. And it's really interesting because Herb's comment, the first comment that Herb made was actually calling for not a broader view, but a sort of a narrower view. Let's be specific, product market by product market. Let's not look at gatekeepers at the level of the overall firm. So I would say really the question is I think a good question to ask would be, what is the right level of analysis at which we are going to get most insights if we're looking at the situation that we're looking at? Again, the question being the pluses and the minuses on competition and innovation of big tech. If we think about, the traditional theory of competition is that competition brings us the goodies. Competition is the best process by which everyone's going to be better off. The competition happens at the level of product markets. And within each single market, if we let competition happen, the inefficient firms are going to get out because whatever they're going to offer is not going to have the quality and the price that's going to be attractive to consumers. And therefore, there is a sort of discipline of the market that's going to cleanse out of the economic system the firms that don't produce as much value that is socially optimal. Okay? What's not to like about this? This is fantastic, right? Now, where did the value from, so it's clear where value from competition happens. It happens in markets. The beneficiaries are both users and the surviving firms and society at large, okay? Now, in that framework, how is collaboration organized and how does value from complementarity being exploited? right? So it is either within firms, you know, if we think about transaction cost theories, that's why firms exist, because they do all that messy stuff of collaboration that cannot be arbitraged effectively in markets because it's complex to actually formulate what the contract is going to be. So within firms is where the complementarity is exploited, or as we know, across supply chains, and that's being governed through buyer-supplier contracts. So we have a framework for that. Okay. I think what is new and different about online versus offline, to sort of bounce on another one of Herb's comment, and I would like Herb to tell me later if you think that makes any sense, what I'm saying, is that I think one of the distinguishing features of value creation via digital means is because it facilitates the identification of complementarities across economic agents, the identification of these complementarities, and the exploitation of these complementarities. To simplify, you know, because we can identify what the data mean when it's bring together with another data, and everything is connected to everything. Now, I think what we see is a different kind of modality of value creation, which has its own sort of organizational forms, which are those platform firms, which can exploit those complementarities, not just within the safe confines of the product market, which were really convenient for us because that's within those walls that competition happen. Remember, competition brings about the good things. But actually, across those separate, hitherto separate sectors, where there is a genuine value creation that is happening. This leads us to ask a question which I think is a question that we don't have an answer to yet, but I would love to, you know, participate in a collaborative effort to get to a better answer, is what would it look like to have really good functioning ecosystems, really well functioning ecosystems? You know, I think we have gotten to a point where we know a lot about the performance of the firm. We know what a good, well-performing firm is, even if there's a lot of debates about, you know, is it shareholders' values, stakeholder values. There's been decades of debate about what should be the performance of the firm, how do we measure the performance of the firm, what are the harms that come out of some firm's behavior. But we're only beginning to scratch the surface as to trying to formulate what's a positive, valuable endpoint of what the world looks like when those platform-based ecosystems operate as best as they can. And what I think is that we are reducing the problem in a way that's problematic. We are only looking at one part of the elephant. If we only look at the competition issue, we only look at the competition issue because we remember in the back of our mind that competition brings us the goodies, right? We sort of tend to forget that we have some implicit assumptions about where does the locus of value creation happen, and that's within the confines of those product markets, right? Anything to do with, you know, aggregation and complementarities, we still don't know very much about. There used to be a time in the 1970s people believed in the power of conglomerates. And since then we've said, okay, you know, this should be a conglomerate discount. They're just inefficient. But I think until we formulate a theory which is stronger in terms of what does the world look like when those platform-based competition happen well, and platform and ecosystem governance within the ecosystem, part of which is this self-dealing or self-preferences question that Shane alludes to. That's one of the issues that emerge into what may be a poorly governed ecosystem or not. Until we have a theory of what good looks like, I think we're going to have a really hard time assessing what bad looks like. And so I do think, to answer to your question, Johannes, that yes, I think we need more understanding and more research and more observation that makes sense of the new kind of value creation processes that we see. And I think that the level of analysis will probably be at the level of ecosystems, but we will have to have theories that bring together the ecosystem level and the firm level, and then the product market level. And we are not there yet. And by the way, I want to make a shout out to Bill Lair, who has great comments there, and it's great to have your inputs there. So
we'll circle. Thank you. We'll circle back to the comments in like 15 minutes or something.
Say, Johannes, can I make a brief response to both?
Sure. Yes, please go ahead. I was going to ask you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, on Annabelle's first. every time you see these talks about self-preferencing or multiple products being sold on the same platform, it seems like the right always runs to complementarity and economies of scope as the explanation, and the left always runs to leverage as the explanation. And I think that's a useful line of inquiry, although I think there are some important tools to use in order to tell the difference. One of them is market power. Complementarity can rarely be harmful in the absence of market power. Another one is the availability of consumer choice. For example, how important is it that Google's status on handhelds is the default status? People can switch. Turns out they switch a lot more on desktop laptops than they do on handhelds, but nevertheless, it's an important consideration. And I agree with Annabelle, we need to learn more about that. On Shane's comments, this is a very interesting one to me because he talks about, Amazon more or less reverse engineering third-party sellers' products and then coming up with its own version. And that happens across the board. Not all of the targets of the copying are small. For example, Amazon sells Amazon Basics alkaline batteries in competition with Duracell. Well, Duracell is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, one of the biggest companies in the country, and it also reverse engineers products from smaller firms. Is it a bad thing? No, I think I agree with Shane. Fundamentally, it's not a bad thing. I think one of the things this points to is a little bit of rethinking in our law of intellectual property rights. The policy of IP law generally is to restrict copying of things that are protected by IP rights, but to encourage dissemination of things that are not protected. That's kind of the flip side of IP, and dissemination can be just as important for the transfer of knowledge as IP protection. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, so if Amazon, in the process of copying a third-party merchant's product, if it's violating a patent or a copyright or perhaps even a trademark, that would make litigation appropriate. But how about if this is a public domain product, a product that's not covered by a patent or copyright? And there, let me just say that our current policy is kind of schizophrenic in that regard. For example, when pharmaceutical patents expire, we cannot wait for generics to pile in and come in with their own versions, bringing the price down. So why is it we get all bent out of shape if Amazon does the same thing to a public domain product? Now, one explanation is, of course, that Amazon is taking advantage of confidential information that merchants are supplying to it. That is certainly should be actionable. And we probably have existing legal tools for going after it. However, by far the most useful data point for reverse engineering is a copy of the good. That is to say, what you really need if you want to copy a Belkin charger cord or something like that is you need a copy of the Belkin charger cord, which anybody can get, and then you give it to your engineers and you let them reverse engineer it, and that's probably all they need. And if in fact that is all that is going on, I think we should just move on and let Amazon do what it's doing.
So just to add, one thing you sometimes hear, and this also seems to me to be very testable, this is why it's so interesting, is there's some of the people who worry about self-provisioning by Amazon worry about the listing,
the buy box.
Yeah, the ranks and the designation of favored products and stuff like that. That can and does move market share. But the nice thing about that accusation is that seems eminently testable. And so if it's an advantage or disadvantage, okay, let's go look. And it seems like this sort of thing we can, the ranking, if the bad thing is happening, I'm not saying that it is, I'm just saying if it is, we should be able to see, and you should be able to see what the how ranks translate into sales. You should be able to see, you know, designations affecting direct competitors and so on. So
Well,
there is
that buy
absolutely.
box problem, we know a couple of things. One is that when Amazon puts a product at the top, almost everybody buys that as their choice. That is to say, it is not common that people do, but the other part of it is they are absolutely, consumers are absolutely free to switch with no more than a mouse click. I mean, this is an area where consumer switching costs are extremely low, and so if you don't like Amazon's first choice, you can pick another one. And so what that suggests is that Amazon's customers have a fairly high degree of confidence that when it designates one product or seller as the first choice, that that's the right one for them, and they go ahead and make their order.
Very, very interesting points. Let me sort of spin this a little bit further here. I mean, you already made some really important remarks and interesting thoughts, and you also alluded to the process of innovation, and I want to sort of repeat maybe the sort of this abstract question again on do we know enough about how innovation unfolds in those ecosystems, right? I mean, so we have very often very rudimentary theories of innovation, but really got all the field of industrial organization into a cul-de-sac, I think, was this discussion on is more competition or more monopoly good for innovation or not, right? And it was kind of an falsely construed probably question and tied up for 20, 30 years, many resources. But what we do know in a more dynamic view of innovation is that it's a combination of different things, right? It's the costs of innovation are important, the probability conditions are important, the coordination costs of coordinating in those complicated ecosystems are important. And you all alluded to sort of the conflicting incentives that the platforms may actually have. On the one hand, they want to sort of open up a space to stimulate complementary innovation. But by appropriating some of the value from those activities, or maybe too much of the value of those activities, they may inadvertently then reduce the generativity of their systems. And maybe over time, there's actually evidence that over time, platforms have more of an incentive to appropriate the value that others generate and less of an incentive to create those open spaces. But again, like in the case of competition, it seems that our research is very poor. And so I'm wondering whether you would want to comment on whether we know enough about how innovation in these systems unfolds, and maybe given our time here, tie it to the next question. That is, we see increasingly in Europe and in the United States a reference to new tools of intervention to sort of guide competition, to guide innovation, or keep it vibrant. And we see a moving away from ex post types of interventions to more ex ante types of interventions. Right? One could classify maybe the European ideas in the Digital Markets Act as precautionary antitrust, of anticipatory antitrust policy, where we move away from ex post types of analysis that would make it much easier to respond to the differentiation that you all suggested, right? I mean, we cannot, one model doesn't fit all. More to an per se model where we sort of kind of limit certain types of behaviors. And the question would be, do regulators know enough, given our attestation that our understanding of this process is relatively limited, to make those choices? And isn't there a risk that the movement toward ex ante approaches in the end harms competition and innovation more than perhaps that more traditional approach of ex post interventions? Maybe it needs to be faster. Maybe it needs to have more powerful tools. The one experiment that we have, right, GDPR, for example, seems to suggest that that the regulatory intervention, the policy intervention, had high costs in terms of the generativity of that space. Now one could say, well, this is what we are willing to pay for better privacy protection. But the question here is that the dual question is: do we know about how innovation unfolds, and then should we be concerned about this move toward ex-ante types of intervention that might actually inflict more harm on the process of innovation in those ecosystems, given the complex dynamics, than the traditional types of ex-post interventions that we know and understand. Again, anyone who wants to take this, please go ahead.
It's a hard question.
Well, we have an unbelievable panel of experts. Yes.
Let me at least sketch some of the sketch couple sides of this. What you framed is a very difficult question. So it goes back to something Herb said, but let's at least frame it. So one of the developments, if you look at innovative markets over the long haul, successful commercial entry requires more than just technical skill. It requires technical skill, typically a combination of technical skill and commercial skills that are quite difficult to describe in advance and in any general terms. And so society benefits from a series of experiments coming from both established companies who may have some of those skills and have to acquire the others or develop it internally, or from entrepreneurs who think they have a better idea or better way of doing things. And over the last several decades, particularly in the US, there has developed this, you could almost call it a system of externalizing R&D, where established firms would let entrepreneurial firms, a whole lot of entrepreneurial firms, take the risk, backed often by venture capital, and develop some interesting product or service, and only a small number of them end up successfully doing so, and then they get purchased. Only the successful ones get purchased. So the large firms, the purchasing firms, as I say, externalize the R&D. They didn't do it themselves and buy it from somewhere else. And it turns out the pure form of that activity is quite efficient at what is otherwise a very, very costly activity. R&D is typically very costly to do. I say pure form just because to qualify it properly. Right? That's where the issues emerge. The issues emerge when established firms can also use that same activity to identify potential substitutes in the future, and they have an incentive as well to reduce threats. That's coming from a very different place than the efficient provision of R&D and the lowering of risks. And so that's at the broad levels, the conflict. And then after the fact, it's not surprising you can point to examples. And particularly Facebook buying Instagram is a terrific example. After the fact. The hard part is exactly before the fact. How you implement. One possible way of doing that, as Herb alluded to, is you identify large firms and then you put them through special requirements. And that in and of itself already it introduces other kinds of issues. But that's one approach has been proposed. And having watched the Department of Justice and the FTC over many years try to sort through the thousands of mergers that show up on their plate, asking them to ex ante only identify the dangerous ones. That's a really very tough requirement. And so what the policy problem comes down to, now finally summarizing this, is it comes down to a kind of a type 1 or type 2 error. Do you favor a policy that, say, gives lots of discretion to established firms, in which case you're going to overlook some that after the fact you might have wanted to intervene with? Or do you favor a intervening early, and you're going to make errors because there's just no way a government regulator is going to have sufficient information to always make a correct call?
I just sort of follow up with one,
yeah.
one specific question, right? I mean, you mentioned the type 1, type 2 era to regulate when you didn't have to regulate, or not to regulate when you should have regulated. And markets have that property that they actually self-heal in a sense, right? If you make the error that you don't regulate when you should have, you will notice. But if you regulate when you shouldn't have regulated, it's very difficult to find out, given that there's no counterfactuals in many of those cases, right? And
There's
so
a lot of ideology in those assumptions, Johannes.
Yeah. I'm just sort of pointing out sort of some of the arguments that many people make, right, in that discussion. But Herb, maybe you want to jump in here.
I was just going to say that I think one good spot for a certain amount of ex-ante regulation, which we already do, is mergers. Why? Well, first of all, the cost of remedying a merger before it occurs is very, very much lower than the cost of unscrambling it afterwards, okay? But the other point is that, yeah, we don't know what the effect of an unconsummated merger will be. There's a certain amount of prediction. We do a lot of modeling. It turns out we've gotten more false negatives than false positives in this area, but it's very hard to predict. The thing is, it's not always that hard to look after the fact either and tell what the effect of a merger is. In fact, it can sometimes take several years before we look at a large merger and see what the ultimate effects are. So I'm in favor of a pretty strong ex-ante merger policy, and also a set of guidelines that guide people as to, those guidelines are very general, but at least they do give guidance as to what to do. With respect to the rest of it, I think the costs of ex-ante regulation of things like refusals to deal, self-preferencing, the extent to which a platform can sell both of its own products and those of other people's products. We just don't know enough about those, and we certainly don't know enough about them to make ex-ante categorical judgments. I think we're at least as likely to do more harm than good in that area.
Annabelle, did you want to sort of share your thoughts on that ex-ante versus ex-post?
Could you just, I mean, I sort of got lost into the last few minutes in terms of what was the question that you asked?
So the question,
very interesting comments, but I'm just not sure what you would like me to comment on now.
The question is, we see sort of a move away from more from the historical antitrust ex-post sort of environment in these digital industries toward more ex-ante types of interventions, right? Creating with the best of intentions, I think, creating guardrails and safeguards, behavioral safeguards that companies should obey. And the question is whether this is inadvertently harming innovation rather than supporting innovation, right? And whether sort of a more agile ex-post approach, and maybe combined with what Herb just said in terms of agile merger enforcement, might be a better way to go.
I agree with Herb that I think merger control is an area which could potentially have a lot of upside. And for example, that's really missing in the Digital Markets Act. And so I agree with Herb's point there. I mean, the reason why, at least in the EU, the thinking has evolved away from the traditional ex-post application of antitrust to ex-ante is because of an admission of failure of the antitrust rules the way at least they were applied in the EU. There were not one but 3 different antitrust lawsuits against Google, which spanned over about 10 years, during which there was a lot of excitement on the one hand and fear on the other hand the effect of that, but everybody thought it was going to matter enormously. It turned out it really didn't move the dial very much. So there were a lot of resources spent, a lot of time spent. The situations actually evolved, so it was probably more market power at the end than in the beginning. And so I think it was an admission of failure on the part of the enforcement authorities and the regulators, and that alone is what justified, the move towards looking to ex ante measures, because the European experience was, well, the other thing didn't work out. So I've even heard some European, analysts say, the US are about to find out that it's not going to work out either, while others say, well, actually, the US implementation of antitrust is actually different than the EU, which is sort of builds on the point that Shane was saying, in particular in terms of, breaking up companies is actually possible. It happens very rarely, but it can happen in the US, whereas it's almost never happened in the EU. And then we get into this question that Herb was saying about, the difficulty of unscrambling the egg, if you wish, after a merger happens. There's some work by Tommaso Valetti at Imperial College. He used to be the chief economic officer, the chief economist at the European Commission, who says, well, actually, it should be possible to unscramble the eggs. So just to situate why people have gone towards ex ante was a perception of failure of ex post. Okay, now, is this risky? Yes. Are the rules the right one? We don't really know. Are there risk of implementation failures? For sure. Are there enough resources, expertise, agility in the implementation phase? We don't know yet, So was the alternative, i.e. do nothing, a better solution? Probably not. So I don't know. I mean, I personally think it's better than leaving things just as they were. But is it a risk-free, road? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And actually, I think so. I think that in the US there is an opportunity perhaps to observe what's happening in the EU and learn from this process. And I would like to make a kind of proposal, if you wish, which is in the spirit of what I was saying earlier, which is we need to look at the right level of analysis and looking really precisely at the objects here that are driving the behavior of these firms. Okay, so I have this paper that came out last year in long range planning called Digital Platform Boundaries, where I make this provocative suggestion, which is that the boundaries of the digital platform firm are not just the traditional scope of the firm, but they actually are a combination of three decisions, which are structural decisions that allocate resources to different governance modes. One is the scope of the firm, the traditional one, what do we do inside versus what we let others do. The second one is the configuration of the platform sides, which has to do with making decisions as to who is allowed to be in the platform ecosystem. That could be, who does the platform firm decide to deplatformize because say they want to compete with them, or which participants do they allow in or not the sites. So first boundary decision, the firm scope. The second is the configuration of the platform side. The third is the design of the technological interface that specifies the data flow, the bidirectional data flow between the platform firm and the members of the site. This can be, more one way, more the other way. In a way, you can think about the Cambridge Analytica problem as Facebook being too open in the way that it lets some data, that Cambridge Analytica should not have access to, data about friends of friends. It was too open in that direction. And in that paper, I make a suggestion that we need to look at the behavior of firms in those three dimensions, because sometimes one is a substitute for the other. That is, what you can close up some behavior by either excluding people from sites or by not giving them access to data. And we heard about the example of the acquisition by Facebook of Instagram, when Facebook bought Instagram, originally it looked just like an extension of the scope of the firm. And Facebook promised that it would keep separate the data from the Instagram users and the Facebook users. And it did so for a while, but actually in the end, they ended up bringing all these users in under one side. So I think here is a direction where if we could look at the behavior of firms which make acquisitions, that expand the scope of the firm. It's very hard to know the intent of firms when they acquire a company like Instagram or like WhatsApp. It's very hard to know whether Instagram or WhatsApp would have had the tremendous success they would have had they not been, integrated within the Facebook, system. But what can be observable, I think, over time is the combination of not just the scope of the firm evolution, but what the firm does in terms of the configuration of the site, and importantly, how they behave with regard to the data flows, the digital interface between the platform firm and the sites. And I think, again, to think about what's the right level of analysis or object of analysis, I think we need to consider them together in order to detect patterns that look like, exclusionary behavior. So I think we have different measures now, and we need to think about different measures that really capture the behavior in order to make assessments about, for example, mergers that go beyond the traditional, models that we have about the effect on pricing in the specific product markets, to be a better fit, a better match with the reality of these companies, which have several levers of action they can manipulate, and where there are actually configuration of these bundles of actions across firm scope, firm platform sides, and digital interfaces, some of which are likely to suppress innovation, and others are more in substitutes, and others are not.
Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting, very thoughtful. So I'm going to turn it over to, thank you all, to Volker to bring sort of some of the Q&A into the discussion for the remaining part of our panel here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. What an exciting discussion. And thanks, Annabelle, for opening this actually to also the uncover or unpack all of these issues to give also a lot of food for thought and discussion. So we had some questions, and one is, or a few were by Bill Lair. And since Bill had many questions and comments, and I think they're worthwhile discussing, of course, I would ask Bill actually to ask them themselves, and I will give him the floor and make him a participant of the panel. And of course, he agreed. And I would also offer this option to the other people who ask questions, because I think now it makes sense and we still have the time. I would ask you to be a bit concise in asking the question and focus on the major question, Bill, as well, and also the panelists to be concise in answering them for the sake of time management. Thank you. So, Bill, the floor is yours. You should be able to speak and unmute yourself.
Really, this has been a really interesting panel, and I wish we had a whole lot more time to keep going. And I thought that most of the questions that I asked earlier in the chat, and I would suggest to folks, because there's a lot of other comments other people raised in the chat, grab the chat and stick it in and think about it later, because there's more to follow up here. My comments were really at two levels. One is I really do believe, and I really liked what Annabelle Gawer was saying, is we need a theory of competition amongst ecosystems. So I would have asked, how do you comment about that? A lot of these cases, and I think you could answer that question at many different levels, but I think that is a really interesting question. And I thought also what she suggested about the conglomerate literature and the multi-product competition stuff. I also think way back when about this discussions about the Japanese competition of the Zaibatsu. And that takes me to my second question, which is basically, there's a tension here about anticipatory versus reactionary sort of antitrust policy. Most of antitrust policy is, for example, it's not about having market power, it's about abuses of market power. So first you have to figure out who has market power, then you have to figure out was it actually abused. And that then is sort of, not well matched to the need when we think there's really a risk of a problem going forward. And so maybe the question there really is, at what point do we say this isn't antitrust policy but industrial policy? And it's the combination of the two of those things that ultimately states have to deal with? And at what point would you hand it over to industrial policy and say, you guys figure out how we want to manage the future, and let's not necessarily think we can handle this whole antitrust policy. And let me just stop there because hopefully time for other folks to talk.
Please.
Well, for the U.S., we have an industrial policy for integrated circuits, apparently. We just passed a bill to support that industry in a pretty direct way. And we also had one probably 50 or 60, well, 75 years ago when the Department of Defense told the Bell Labs to make the invention available to everyone and licensed freely. But I think that's we don't have many other examples. So, not least in the U.S.
I would just say one thing about pharmaceutical support, and I think that goes to some of the points that
that's fair.
Herbert was saying about, and also what you were saying about the research funding externalization. Government pays for basic research, industry comes in, and to the extent they're building on it, what extent of those there should be social benefits. But anyway, those are research questions. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That was a research question. It's great. It's a great question, Bill.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of things. It's not antitrust's appropriate role to pick winners or to decide which industries need to be subsidized or supported in some way. It is antitrust's role to make sure that there are not restraints that hinder development in markets, whether or not the government has decided to promote them. So, if we think the U.S. semiconductor industry needs a lot of support in order to favor our position vis-a-vis the Chinese, that's not an antitrust question. That's an industrial policy question. However, if we think that there are restraints occurring within the semiconductor market, whether any restraint that has an effect in the U.S., then I think antitrust policy can go after that, and that will happen whether or not there's an underlying industrial policy in place.
Okay, one other thing Annabelle knows, knows integrated circuits probably better than any of us from her interviews on so many people there. It's just in those firms. But I would add, Intel was in its day was the subject of a lot of U.S. antitrust, and Andy Grove, again in his day, was adamant that he never wanted to go to court. He would tell his people, find out what they want, we'll negotiate hard, and then we'll end up settle out of court. He never wanted to go to court. And it's so fascinating that we are in an era today where some CEOs are willing to go to court. It's a remark a little bit about that.
Annabelle, you wanted to ask something or add something?
This is not a question I ever thought about before. So whatever comments are gonna come out of my mouth are probably not even half baked. I have an impression, if you wish, that people who uphold, if you wish, the benefits of antitrust, are people who are very interested in letting competition happen unfettered, right? Industrial policy is more sort of a command and control view of how to protect a national economy or a regional economy. When things go swimmingly, we can always say, the market's working amazingly well. Let's do everything we can in order to make sure the market works well. That would tend perhaps to say, we need to be very careful about, letting antitrust do its thing. I wonder if the recent upsurge in interest of industrial policy, I know there was this interesting article in the New York Times recently talking about a national network for critical technology assessment, where actually the United States is putting together a team of academics and industrialists to understand America's greatest vulnerabilities, both in terms of supply chain or the production of critical components that may not come their way because of breakdown in the supply chains or political tensions across regions, et cetera, et cetera. So perhaps when markets or global markets or globalization, as we thought was the answer to everything, doesn't seem to deliver the goods, then perhaps there is more energy, so to speak, focused on more of a command and control industrial policy type thing. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just this is your job, this is our job, there is a neat division of labor and let's not mix this. I'm wondering whether it's a hypothesis, whether there isn't actually an underlying political climate within which there's more resources and expectations on letting markets do what they do when we're happy about what the outcome is, or saying actually we need to complement that with more industrial policy. It's just an open question. It's an empirical question. It's a hypothesis.
Thank you very much. Great question. A great discussion. Next question is again from Bill, but not Bill Lear. The other Bill Kane, please go ahead.
Okay. I'll just say I'm a participant, observer, researcher, and I've lived in the Seattle tech ecosystem for 40 years. And so what I say is what I've observed is in the tech startup process over the years, you've gotten accelerators and incubators and lots of institutions to connect universities and industries more intimately than they have been before. And one thing that is clear is you see a phenomenon of serial entrepreneurs, people who are skilled at founding companies and building them up to revenue generation phase. And then the investors say, well, we don't want to grow by ourselves anymore. We want to merge want to go into a larger company. And to me, that's quite different than what it was 50 years ago. And so the whole innovation system has changed a little bit. And basically what I was doing was trying to highlight that as a reality and saying, can government actually look at how capable is government of meddling with that system? Are they going to do anything better than what's happening naturally? And so it's an open question. I was just curious what the panel had to say about it.
Who wants to go first? Shane?
Oh, thank you for the question. It's a great question. The part with a great question. I was hoping the other panelists would jump in and I have time to think of something. Let me focus on the thing you put in the chat. You identified a number of mergers that after the fact, Google, YouTube, Microsoft, LinkedIn, Amazon, Zappos, and Goodreads. I might also add Microsoft, GitHub. And for fun.
Yeah, there's plenty you can fill in.
Fill in. And how about AT&T and Time Warner, which, just to give us an example of one that really did not go well. So the whole range. It's a great example of the range of things that can happen. I want to focus on the Google YouTube one for a bit because it does actually identify both the two sides of it. YouTube, when they were acquired by Google was, it's true, at the same time trying to do something very similar. And so it would, one would say, from an ex-ante perspective, that potentially that was a reduction in competition. Have to recall at the time as well, Google was not nearly as large as well, so want to make a little bit of qualification there. The interesting thing about that one is after the fact, Google put an enormous amount of money into YouTube. And at least two things I've got to give them credit for. One is the automated identification of copyrighted music, which I don't think anybody had really invented until then at the scale that they've done it, which is really quite impressive. And then the second thing is the creation of advertising around video and user-generated video, and now at this point, professionally produced video. That turned out to be a lot harder than anybody anticipated. And so to Google's credit, they actually created quite a bit around that. And it's a little hard to think in the alternative where that merger had not occurred, that YouTube would have been able to do that on its own at the same speed. So it's it's tough. These are tough ones. I could go on at length about a lot of these mergers because I know a lot of them in detail, but that's just that one gives you a good sense of the real why it's tough.
Thank you very much, Shane. Annabelle, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really hard problem. It's a hard problem because, a very large percentage of these acquired smaller firms are complements or principally complements. Many of them are potential competitors, and their antitrust always has this problem that, the field of competitors is relatively limited, but pretty much everybody is a potential competitor with everybody else. I think the case for intervention is a little bit stronger with somebody like Facebook and Instagram. Facebook was well established in its market. Instagram was an upstart, but was clearly targeting some space occupied by Facebook. And I think that would have been a good situation where we should have intervened. And now the Federal Trade Commission is going to try to undo that. But I don't think we should be in the business of just going wholesale after acquisitions of firms that do not have a substantial presence as a competitor to the acquiring firm. There's been a hugely growing literature lately on so-called potential competition mergers, but surprising absence of theory as to how much you have to prove in order to go after a purely potential competition merger. I mean, the most famous case in the U.S. Supreme Court is P&G, Procter & Gamble in '67, which condemned P&G's acquisition of Clorox. This is not an internet merger case, obviously, but at the time, P&G was not making bleach, just plain old chemical bleach, public domain product, pretty easy to make, but a lot of branding and advertising attached to it. And the government permitted the challenge on the basis that P&G would have developed bleach on its own had it not acquired Clorox, and that case sailed through. Was it a good decision? I kind of doubt it. But if we're going to expand merger policy to the point that we're always asking a question, will one or the other of these firms potentially develop a product in the future that's going to cause harm? I think we're stepping out on an awfully big limb and giving up a lot of merger efficiencies in the process.
Thank you very much. Annabelle, quick last comment?
No, thank you. I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. It was just a fantastic discussion. And I think we've, discussed so many areas and we could continue because it's extremely fruitful here. Thanks for everyone on the panel, but also attendees and your questions. We couldn't address all questions now due to time constraints, obviously, but of course we wouldn't expect, right, that we answer all questions there are or explore all in one session. But thanks again to everyone. It was really, really fascinating. Excellent. And Johannes, I think the last word, maybe.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. I mean, I've tried to be the devil's advocate here somewhat and push you. And I think I would actually be interested in perhaps staying connected on this question of, but how can we come up with specific research programs? And I like this notion of comparative research, right? One option that policy has actually if we are not certain what kind of instrument would help us to muddle through, right, in any particular case, is we could actually think about creating institutional diversity, where we actually create like a meta environment of different settings. But that's of course more of a brainchild rather than anything that can be implemented in policy. But I think the research community, in my view, has a responsibility to help sort of bridge some of those areas where we lack knowledge, and policy needs to act. I think there's clearly, we have a sense that the hopes that we had in the digital economy are kind of not measuring up to what we see, or sort of what we see is not measuring up to the hopes. And I fully understand sort of the need and appreciate the need to intervene. And I think over time we'll have to enable that learning process to improve the way we do it. And that's what I see as the role of researchers. And I think your discussion, your fantastic sort of insights have really contributed to move this a notch further. So thank you very much. Highly appreciate your comments and your time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity and great to see you.
Great to see you.
Nice to see all of you. Yes.